Thank you. Thank you, Don, also, and all your assistants, and for putting on such a dynamic gathering and for inviting me to be part of it. I'll just say just a quick word about that one subtitle of this, part of the title of the Schema of the Heart. This is actually the next installation or next project that's coming after these earlier ones that Don mentioned. And what I understand by that briefly is a distinctive sphere of givenness and evidence that it cannot be subsumable to reason and rationality on the one hand, or sensibility on the other, and the traditional dualisms that go along with that, either in terms of, primarily in terms of gender. But that distinctive sphere of givenness I'm using now as a schema of the heart. I've tried to just develop distinctive terminology for that, and they don't always coincide with the literature, but basically concerns on one level, and I'll deal with this in a little bit, feeling and feeling states and that distinction, and within feeling broadly I understand emotions, which are personal and interpersonal, attunements, which are intransitive, psychophysical feelings, for example, erotic comportment, and then feeling states. Feeling states that I distinguish between passions, and I'll say a word about that in a moment, but passions, affects, and what I call conditions, which are the actual reflective states on those. So anyway, that's just the broad outline, and I'm here just dealing with a very thin slice of that have to do with the emotions, and within the emotions, some loving, but turning to the dark side, hating. So in this paper, I have a fundamental concern that can be expressed in a few short questions. What is the relation of hating to loving? Are these two coeval acts? Do they stand in a dialectical relation? Or is hating founded in loving, and if so, in what ways? So I want to begin this paper, first of all, by introducing the context in which hating emerges, and then turn to the act of hating, describing some characteristics of it. Then I consider the relation of loving and hating's relation of foundation. Then in a final section, I explicate an implicit distinction between relations of, well, I'll be very brief, but relations of grounding and founding, and then to suggest that hating is a contrary movement to loving, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So first of all, the context of hating. Systematically and phenomenologically, the problem of hating occurs within the larger problem of evidence that I've addressed, in any case, in earlier works, and I've described in terms of different kinds of givenness and phenomenology of mysticism. Givenness is what I called epiphany, just peculiar to religious experience. That's the only term I really found that might have been appropriate for it. Revelation is the term that I use for interpersonal or moral emotions. And so loving, like hating and some other emotions, belong to this sphere of revelation. Again, a distinctive kind of givenness, distinctive kind of evidence that is peculiar in this regard to persons, I think. In this regard, the descriptions of loving and hating are primarily in service of articulating the broader phenomena of vocations and exemplars as kinds of personal revelation or self-revelation. So it's in this framework that I want to investigate the relation between loving and hating, and then suggest, or at least consider, how hating relates to loving. So just very briefly, loving, I understand, as a movement now of verticality. And by suggesting that loving is a movement of verticality, I mean that it's a dynamic movement of givenness toward the emergence and flourishing of what is possible within this movement of being, or being as becoming. I want to begin with a clue to loving, that it's an improvisational creative, positive affirmation of this movement of verticality, as generative of this movement in a distinctively personal manner. Or put still differently, I want to suggest that loving is a movement toward the flourishing or enhancement of the beloved, whatever beloved, in its own most way, within that beloved's magnitude or its own value range, as it were. The mystics, at least in the Abrahamic tradition that I've considered, Simone Weil, Teresa of Avila, Rabbi Dov Ber, Ruz Bahan Bagli, call this process of loving surrender, because primordial loving for them and finite loving, finite persons loving, are neither identical nor different from each other, yet finite personal loving can be said to participate this larger sense of loving. As I want to suggest in the exposition below, hating, or to follow, hating emerges fundamentally as always already founded in loving. Even though this is the case, hating is a negative act in the sense that it negates the core of the other as bearer of value, whatever that range, the value range is. This affects all levels of value, from the holy, the person, living things, tools. Since hating takes place within the movement of loving in relation to all beloveds, because of this ontological, or we can maybe say metaphysical dimension of loving, which is vertical and what I understand as delimiting, D-limiting, so opening in that sense. Not only does loving go beyond a single act and beyond a particular value sphere, hating too ultimately affects all dimensions of reality. So, the next section, hating and hatred. Hating carries the basic connotations for us of negativity, enmity, personal animosity, resistance or aversion, rejection, denial, denigration, but it also is associated for us with anger, rage, loathing, disgust, revulsion, contempt, or disdain. One could go on. We might hear someone exclaim, "Oh, I hate all this rain," or "I hate to go to the gym," or "I hate olives on my pizza." But I think these are at least the way I understand it, these are colloquialisms that in these contexts express something more like dislike or inconvenience or even a matter of taste, rather than the movement of hating as an emotion in the sense that I've tried to understand it. So in this section, I want to make a preliminary distinction between hating and hatred within the more general category of feeling and feeling states, as I alluded to a few moments ago. I'll then look at some characteristics of hating. So first of all, feeling and feeling states. The difference between hating and hatred is rooted in the more general phenomenological distinction between a feeling and a feeling state. I take feeling as a general term that encompasses the entire schema of the heart, or almost all of it, as it includes certain personal and interpersonal emotions like shame, guilt, love, trust, attunements such as anxiety, boredom, or nostalgia, as well as psychophysical anonymous feelings. So this would be anonymous in the Merleau-Ponty sense, enjoyment, or even, I think in a certain respect, erotic feeling. This is the case insofar as feelings have their own distinctive order of givenness and evidence, as I've mentioned. A relation with value, where value concerns the affective or emotional resonance or coloring as messengers of meaning or sense. Thus, when we live the situation as a whole, say driving a car, the sense or meaning is given, the epistemic grasping of car, but the value dimension is given in a feeling, say as a spiritual, vital, sensible feeling, as useful, as comfortable, or as in service of another, such that the value is already given as a messenger of the comprehended intellectual sense of it. So it's not a thing, it's a kind of coloring harbinger. A feeling state, in distinction to feeling, is given on the basis of a feeling givenness of that living experience, rather than the dynamic movement A feeling state is precisely that, a state which can be expressed as a passion. So in this way, a feltness or a sentiment, an affect, or a condition. Further, it can become an explicit object without losing its character as feeling state, whereas a feeling loses its character when it becomes, it doesn't mean it's not going on, but it loses its character as movement in the grasping it as such. So a feeling state is static, whereas a feeling is an act movement, as it were, and never can become an object as such. Examples of passions founded in feelings include rage, sorrow, hatred, joy, anger, pleasure, being blue, anxiousness. Although experientially, feeling states can be given along with feelings, and in fact, not just can, but must. We can distinguish them phenomenologically since they are lived differently. Furthermore, while I can hate in anger, love with sadness, repent in sorrow or joy, these are distinguishable in certain ways, as I'll say below. Affects, as I mentioned, the term would include for me sensation, pain, tickling, itching, or even where the whole body is subject to an affect. Startle, for example, would be a bodily affect, paroxysm or so on. It affects the whole body. Finally, I may not be aware of my feeling state in its disclosive capacity as a feeling state while I'm living through it. It is only subsequently that I can reflect on it. So, for example, on what I'm calling a passion, I can reflect on that feeling state, a particular passion, anger, whatever. When somebody asks me, why are you so angry? Or it can be called to my attention when I think, why am I so sad? Or, well, what are you so excited about? So when the feeling state is reflected upon this way, or, I'm not being very clear, when the passion is reflected upon this way, because it's a feeling state, it's given differently, namely as a condition. A condition is not the feeling state lived in its feltness. As a sentiment, we could think of lived sorrow, for example. Rather, a condition is the feeling state objectified as state. So I'd like to make several brief observations concerning some main characteristics of the feeling-to-feeling states that are relevant here. I'm not just making these distinctions for the fun of it. I think it's important primarily to try to get clear about what we're talking about when we mean hating, and to avoid, hopefully, some confusion when we're talking about the movement of hating that we often and commonly associate with hatred. Okay, and then this relates then to the movement of loving. All right, so first of all, I'm just going to summarize these comments here, but we could talk about them. Feeling states are structurally dependent upon or founded in feeling, as this feeling states relates to another as bearer of value. Secondly, it is impossible to determine in advance what feeling states might emerge from feelings. Or another way of saying this, there is an infinite possibility of what feeling states might emerge from feelings, even though a feeling will always be accompanied by a feeling state. This is the case even if a particular feeling state might be more commonly associated with feeling, so hatred with hating. Third, not only is it impossible to determine in advance what feeling states might emerge from feelings, it is also not possible to exhaust the number of feeling states emerging from feelings. This is implied from the earlier one. And fourth, while there's an wide open possibility of what feeling states might be emergent from feelings, I think that there are some that are essentially excluded. Well, that was my question. Can we exclude any? Are there anything that don't arise? And so some cannot emerge from certain feelings. For example, I think that impatience as a feeling state cannot emerge from hoping, and that has to do with analyses that I did in the moral emotions. Or I don't think hatred can emerge from loving as through this process of an auto-affection of the feeling. So how they get produced is, I think, the auto-affection of the feeling immediately produces the feeling state. That it depends on the context of the person in a situation, all sorts of other certain socio-historical and personal conditions. All right, hating and hatred. I use hating for the act of hating and hatred to designate the feeling state. Hating is not simply a feeling as an intentional structure with its own style of evidence. Hating takes place as an emotional, dynamic act movement within the locus of person. As an act in which the person is revealed and as such never becomes an object, as an interpersonal or what I've called a moral emotion, hating is phenomenologically distinguishable from possible emergent feeling states like anger, rage, jealousy, schadenfreude, and even hatred. While the latter, the feeling states, are essentially dependent upon hating in some form, they're irreducible experientially to that hating. The fact that there are phenomenological distinctions to be made between hating and hatred, which is to say that they are irreducible experientially, this fact can be seen in three variations or implications of this feature, I believe. First of all, what we can call the non-necessity of experiencing any feeling state in order to hate. In other words, a feeling state is not a springboard to hating or any other feeling, just as a feeling state is not a springboard to, well, as I said, any emotional or personal act. It's not possible to experience hatred in order then to hate. Or put it differently, I could not put myself in the state of anger, for example, in order then to execute the act of hating. Likewise, I do not have to experience joy in order then to love. In short, I do not have to feel hating as a movement of negation in order to hate. This is because feeling states are founded in feelings and not the other way around. Secondly, the necessity of hating as feeling being accompanied by some feeling state or feeling states. That's the second point. Feeling states are generated through the auto-affection of feelings, whether those feelings are on a personal or psychophysical level. What is important to note is that the auto-affection only occurs in the feeling as relating to some other as bearer of value. Thus, it's not kind of an immediate self-affection, this auto, I think it's not a self-affection. There's kind of, it takes place, what I mean to say is it takes place through a feeling intentionality. There's not an immediate, so it's not ennui, basically. I don't think. There's a feeling intentionality, as it were, and it's through that relatedness to the other in feeling as an act movement, or in this case an act movement, that a feeling state is generated and given in this kind of auto-affection. Third point, the non-necessity of the feeling state being hatred or any negatively valenced feeling state. For example, it can be a positive feeling state. They can be negative or positively valenced. Certainly, hating can be accompanied by a thumos, or by, more specifically, a despising, a wanting to destroy, a desiring to negate, or it can be accompanied or associated with other emotions and their feeling states like anger or outrage. And perhaps more deeply, I can feel hatred in the hating with a particular intensity. I can feel being irritated by the beloved's mere existence. But I can also hate without having to experience hatred in this sense, namely, in the sense that I feel the negative movement with a positive passion. For example, hating can be given with a joy, a feeling state usually associated with something like loving, or it could be accompanied by a schadenfreude, namely taking pleasure in the misery of others. Accordingly, it's possible to hate or to live in and through the movement of hating while experiencing the delight in the negation of others. Or I could be cold and calculating, merely procedural, utterly dispassionate, while living in the movement of hating. And so the reason why that was important for me to distinguish is we can think about how the participation in capitalism, or acts as, in capitalism, let's just say, that might, it might be benevolent and feel good, but still live in a hating movement without feeling hatred. Okay. So now let me just mention some characteristics of hating to line up in order to distinguish it from loving. So I have suggested that hating is a movement, a personal, creative, enacting process of negating, diminishing, or restricting someone or something as bearer of value. It is not, for example, just a more intense feeling state, like anger or rage. It's not even a modification of a feeling state, like hatred. I think hating is simply a modification of hatred. So allow me to parse out this statement by observing some essential features of hating. First of all, hating as an act. Hating is an improvisational, freely executed act that takes place in the level of spirit, and more specifically in the dimension of personhood. As person, I exist in and through each act, immediately, intimately, fully, but inexhaustively. Hating is a creative movement out of personal freedom. By creative here, I mean that it's an expressive transformation. It's generative beyond the givens. However, in its creative execution, hating's destructive, expressively transformative of the givens in a destructive manner, ultimately moving against generativity. This creative dimension is in part what Kolnai wants to evoke by calling hate an historical aspect of human life. Hating emerges in the movement of loving, but rejects that generative movement in human love and freedom, and emerges as a destructive or rejecting force, or again, it reveals itself as negating or diminishing. Further, hating does not grow out of any emotion genetically. Hating's not a more intense embarrassment, or shame, or guilt, or sympathy. Even if we see a temporal development from someone growing angry to the point of destroying something, the latter doesn't produce hating. Hating's a qualitatively distinct act that's carried out on the personal level, and in this sense has a metaphysical or phenomenological priority in terms of its status, and does not necessarily map onto a genetic or historical development of events. Hating as directed. Hating is oriented, and in this orientation it's directed towards some other, even if that other is myself. I mean by this that hating is a distinctive kind of intentionality that's related towards some other as bearer of value. However, just because it's a feeling, and more specifically an emotion, and thus exhibits an intentionality of some kind, this does not mean that hating has a structure of an objectivating act, or that it's founded in an objectivating act in order to allow an object to be given as sense, such that it can acquire the status of a constituted object. Hating, like loving, does not exhibit the traditional noesis, noema correlation. This does not mean, though, that hating is non-intentional, or doesn't have the structure of intentionality, is what I want to say, as if it were a mood or an atmosphere. Not so that there are certain feeling phenomena that don't have a structure of intentionality, and Heidegger has pointed those out, but this is not one of them. Okay, hating as other-oriented. This is related to the former point, but whereas the former point emphasized the oriented character, this point emphasizes the otherness character of the dimension of hating, that toward which hating is directed. Hating takes place in a personal manner, but it can be directed toward any other as bearer of value, I think, even though most radically hating is directed toward the person. It is not the value that I hate, but the other, insofar as the other is bearer of value. And even though hating can be directed toward any other as bearer of value, the deepest and most fundamental kind of hating is a person-to-person hating that denies or diminishes the person on an interpersonal basis. So that is to say, it presupposes the interpersonal basis that it's negating. Thus, not only is hating an interpersonal or moral emotion because it's oriented toward another, it is a moral emotion or interpersonal emotion because it presupposes the interpersonal nexus in which it negates or diminishes any other. Where other persons are concerned, my hating is directed at their very core, the very core of their existence. It does not matter what they say or do or stand for in that movement of hating experienced at that time. For example, I can hate this other person at his or her core, even if she or he has qualities I admire, just as I can love the person, even if he or she exhibits qualities I detest or cause me discomfort. Accordingly, to cite Kolnai again, he can assert that what we are calling hating impinges not only on the object as such, but on its existential status in the world, thus on the world itself, and accordingly on the essence of the subject, the hated. While it is in and through the features that others have that I might hate, it is instead the person as a whole, or the personal core, whom I'm hating. This is an observation that we can see in Kolnai and Ortega Gasset, Shaler, and many others. In hating, we have a presupposition of the interpersonal nexus in and through the denial, exclusion, or negating of the person. Needless to say, I not only can hate another person, I can hate myself as person. The point I want to make here by citing Kolnai's observations where this explication of hating is concerned is that for me, the hating as emotion and as a movement goes beyond the actual negation of the other. The hating can continue even after the factual absence of what is hated. The insight here is that the hating movement is toward the existential annihilation of the other and can continue beyond its actual destruction, death, or even murder. Hating is not just a single act in time, but reaches ontologically or metaphysically, in some cases including the intention that this other never to have existed at all. And in this way goes beyond the particular negation. Okay, hating is self-revelatory and non-revelatory. Oh. Hating, like loving, belongs to the distinctive sphere of givenness I call revelation. Loving is both self-revelatory and revelatory. Loving is both self-revelatory and revelatory of otherness. Like loving, hating is a revelatory act, but hating is revelatory in only one respect. It is revelatory insofar as I am given or revealed as who I am becoming. In acts I live through, I intrinsically cohere as this person in and through these acts without gaps, without standing above or below them, as it were, although I'm not exhausted in them. In and through the acts of hating in which I exist, I am revealed personally, in this instance, as hating, as a unique person identifiable in such and such a manner. In this sense, hating can never be anonymous, but is a personal I. So like I, Tony, hate. Accordingly, hating is self-revelatory, but as self-dissimulating in this being self-revelatory. It's self-dissimulating because it negates what it presupposes in that self-revelation. Therefore, even though I might be directed towards some other in my hating is self-negating because it distorts or decreates the interpersonal nexus in which I am ultimately given to myself. In distorting the context in which hating emerges, I become distorted through hating. So it's a self-distorting, self-dissimulating might be too epistemic, but self-deforming maybe. However, in a different respect, hating is not revelatory, namely of otherness, whereas loving is both self-revelatory and revelatory. For example, loving can be understood as an opening to what is other, as letting appear of its own accord, inciting but not provoking that other to peer out a little further in terms of its own being becoming. Hating, however, takes up what is given in loving as toward its negation, and in manifold possible modes closes down what can appear as value. Hating is the act of decreation, even to the point of wanting the other no longer to exist or never even to have existed at all. So hating as negating movement. One of the peculiar things about hating is that it is a creative movement toward another given as value. But precisely as dynamic, as generative beyond the givens, as improvisational, as directed movement, hating is destructive of that very movement. This is most clearly evident when hating is directed toward another person, who essentially can never become an object. But it is also the case when hating is directed toward bearers of vital values, living organisms, such things as toys, like bearers of value of pleasure or enjoyment, or tools. Again, hating can occur in these ways because it takes up what's given in loving as toward its negation, and in manifold possible modes closes down what can appear as value. Most profoundly, hating unfolds on a personal or interpersonal level, but all levels are at least indirectly affected, since these dimensions of being are interrelated through a kind of vertical delimitation. Hating does not have to be oriented toward all-out destruction. Indeed, negating appears as a removing and excluding, as diminishing, as restricting, as injuring, or as even discouraging someone from becoming who they can be. By contrast, I can be in competition with someone, like in a sporting event, and have an enemy, an adversary, or a rival, a nemesis. I may want to trounce her in my sprint on the track, win the battle. I want to win the race, all the while without hating him or her or the group. So struggling against something or someone is not necessarily hating. For these reasons, the negation of a negative value is not necessarily hating. And hating a bearer of a negative value is not tantamount to loving. For example, if I'm confronted with a dilapidated building that is unfit for housing people, and if I negate it by tearing it down, I'm not necessarily hating. However, if you say, oh, I hate that, if not just I hate like I don't like, if I truly hate even that building and I raise it, I would be oriented somehow to still baser and baser value. That does not transform the hated or get outside of the hating. So hating as a negating or diminishing value diminishes that other even more so. It doesn't turn it into loving. Here the negation of a negation is not a positive. The negating movement of hating, therefore, presupposes itself as a dynamic movement, but carries us out by negating or objectifying all other movement. Accordingly, hating is a creative, originary negating movement directed towards something that's given as value. Because hating rejects or negates, it cannot remain indifferent, apathetic, or what I'll call later slovenly, in relation to what gives itself. Not hating the beloved. The most basic movement of hating consists in a negating movement of what is given as value. I can only hate because loving, which is revelatory of the given as beloved, reveals or gives what can be hated. Accordingly, I don't really hate the hated. Rather, I hate the beloved, which makes it so tragic. That is, through hating, what is given primordially as beloved in loving, which is basically the condition for that to emerge, the value to emerge, is constituted as the hated. The beloved gets constituted as the hated. That should not mean that first I love something or someone, and that this thing or person is my beloved, and then I hate him or her. Okay, it should not be taken to mean that I must experience feelings of joy or hatred in the negating movement. Rather, it suggests that on the basis of what is revealed, what I'm calling here the beloved, in the most giving or opening act, namely in loving, what's revealed in that, on the basis of that, hating's a diminishing, restricting, or negating the other, which has already been revealed implicitly, at least as beloved. A more detailed analysis of temporal orientations of hating developed, that I've tried to develop elsewhere, has suggested that This, I think, decisive character of the temporal meaning of hating holds for the act of hating. So I can't go through the details of the temporality, but hating reduces the other to fixed permanent present. Hating attempts to keep the other, whatever other, ever now, without temporal past or future horizons. Likewise, it attempts to consolidate the past and future into the present so it can be controlled and maintained as such. However, since hating anticipates no end to itself in the destruction of the other, the diminishing of the other can never be completed in the present. Hating is never fulfilled, not because it is always anticipating more to come, but because hating strives to keep the hated present as devalued. Thus, hating makes the hated present and keeps it present in order to deny it or negate it, which amounts to the temporality of a permanent fixed present. We are accustomed to assume a symmetry between various affections, sentiments. Oh, well, I'm sorry, I read over my subtitle just so you know where we are. Okay, that concluded that section. Loving and hating. Okay, so we're accustomed to assume a kind of symmetry between various affections, sentiments, and emotions that admit of positive and negative valences, like liking and disliking, pleasure and displeasure, appetite and repugnance, attraction and aversion, as well as loving and hating. Not only is a symmetry often presumed, but it is also sometimes given as if it were a dialectical relation. We can think of a kind of codependence or equal primordiality that's presupposed in the case of what Annette Baer calls trust and antitrust. It's a good example in terms of another moral emotion. In a similar, for me, problematic vein, Luc Ferry writes, "And love never comes without hatred. They are probably two inseparable passions," I'm quoting, "if only because love leads us to hate those who hurt the people we love, or even sometimes to hate those we have loved when they hurt us, leave us, or cheat on us," close quote. Psychoanalytically, Eros and Thanatos are in most accounts understood to be coeval. In a genetic perspective, it's also suggested that the baby's first love, the mother or mother's breast, is disturbed at its roots by destructive impulses, such that love and hate struggle together in the baby's mind, and that there is a constant interaction of love and hate in us all, Melanie Klein, for example. Such a symmetry, equal primordiality, and dialectical relation where loving and hating are concerned, I argue, are not accurate, and against that, I want to, that's the kind of result, but what I want to look at and see why, that they are not coeval or parallel movements, and that on a positive side, that hating is actually founded in loving. So phenomenologically, I think it's possible to justify, or seemingly to justify, two main possibilities of discerning the relation between loving and hating. One in which they're coeval, parallel movements. Another in which hating is founded in loving. So the first, let's presuppose that why would we want to say that they're parallel movements? Well, the first option then is to consider them as different value apprehensions sharing the same value content. This interpretation is attractive for various reasons, but ultimately is problematic. The attractive aspects of this are the following. One could say loving and hating are oriented toward the other, whatever other, insofar as the other is bearer of value. Both loving and hating can be understood as value cognitions. This is in part how loving and hating differ from, a slovenliness of spirit or a mere indifference, one could say. But whereas loving is oriented toward the affirmation of the value given, hating is oriented toward the negating or denying of the bearer of value. Now, so far, maybe that's unproblematic. But on this interpretation, where loving is concerned, we'd have a cognition of value, the affirmation of the bearer of value toward its flourishing, and this would be one act. And then we'd have hating, which would be a cognition of value, like loving, and then the denial of the bearer of value and the negation of its flourishing, and this would be one concrete act. Now, again, the advantage of clarifying the relation of loving and hating in this way is that it accounts for how loving and hating can be so close in their value, or cognition or recognition of value. Why radical loving and radical hating, we could say, are so close in some ways, but they're so diverse and maybe diametrically opposed. The difficulty with this depiction is that it relies on a static analysis of structure and mirrors what we find in the presentational sphere of the form-content distinction. It erroneously presupposes that there's a neutral givenness and then an affirmation or denial, like the givenness of some neutral stuff empirically in perception, and then an apprehension or an interpretation that would overlay the former in order to be the concrete perception of something. Now, against that, I want to consider hating as founded in loving. In order to discern the relation of hating to loving in this way, let's look again at the context of hating. Especially where loving is concerned, an act phenomenology has to be grounded in the metaphysical reality to which phenomenology is open and as a reality that is also accessible phenomenologically. I've called this movement generativity, called it verticality, but I think in this context it can be called loving. Loving is an opening to all that is as bearer of value in all of its distinctive value magnitude, without necessarily any preference or choice among the richness that comes forth in its distinctiveness. This is because loving is prior to preferring and choosing. Loving in that sense, we could say, is all-encompassing. Thus, in loving, the bearer of value of what gives itself in the way that it gives itself is already an invitation to affirm, which is grounded in an already affirmed, or we could also say, to love what is already generatively beloved. This is another way of saying that the primordial movement of loving as an integrated movement, as a movement of already affirmed affirming further, that gives what can be seen of value. That loving is an opening that is already a living out of what gives itself in loving. As we already might suspect, loving, therefore, already has a weight and priority that's not a mere counterpart to hating. It encompasses all levels of reality, even though a hating act might be oriented towards something as bearer of value, of one sphere of value, and it impacts all spheres of reality in that way. So it also affects all spheres of reality, but there's a certain weight or priority that I want to try to elucidate. Since the movement of hating the point here is that the movement of hating gets its bearer of value feed. It's a clumsy way of saying it. But what is disclosed as beloved, or as the beloved, comes from loving, and in hating I close it down or destructive of what can appear as value, continuing to negate or diminish the other from the movement of loving. It presupposes the positive foundation which it negates. This means that when one hates, one has to do so already within the ongoing movement of loving. Or again, I can only hate because as I am hating, I am more primordially and simultaneously moving within loving. Loving, therefore, already has a weight and priority that is not a mere counterpart to hating. I can only hate because loving, which is revelatory of the given as beloved, because loving reveals or gives what can be then hated, or what's constituted as hated. Accordingly, I don't hate the hated primordially, I hate the beloved, which in hating is constituted as the hated. Second, related to this point, loving is such that any personal loving implies experiencing the compelling modality of a loving response. This is due to the fundamental interpersonal nature of loving, and in fact, more generally, that we are not self-grounding, that we do not start off as isolated, neutral individuals who putatively then love. This says two things. On the one hand, Loving is an originary act in the sense that loving is not a reaction or a motivated feeling. It's not what I call a receptive emotion like embarrassment, shame, guilt, or surprise. Rather, loving, like trusting, is originary, initiatory, creative, or improvisational, and may not depend on the way in which self-temporalization unfolds in certain experiences. Thus, the reception of loving is always already the compelling cognition of a loving response, before I could choose one way or the other, or before I could comport myself as if nothing happened. All this without compulsion. Compelling, but no compulsion. Accordingly, Shaler writes, I may indeed refuse any response of love, but if I do, then I must deny this to the personal other. I must refuse. In other words, this denial, refusal, or negation essentially takes place on the basis of loving. They are creative negative movements on the basis of an affirmation that's already functioning guidingly or being felt or received, no matter how vaguely. It is possible then to state the problem differently. If there is loving as felt, insofar it's loving as felt, then there's a demand of a response of loving. It's not a demand in a loose sense. It's not a compulsion. It's not a provocation. But this is because loving's already caught up in an interpersonal movement. The structure of loving is such that it calls for loving. There's no gap, no neutral standing back, no option, no picking out choices of response like on a shelf or something like that way, which had already come too late. It is not a mere invitation, but already a kind of imposition or evocation to love. And I've tried to talk in a different context about this kind of imposition in relation to trust. There's already an imposition to trust if somebody trusts me whether I want it or not. But okay. If this is the case, then how do we account for a no to loving? How do we account for this negativity? This no has to be understood as already a denial or a rejection on the basis of a positive movement. This does not mean, as Shaler cautions, that there is in loving an intention toward a response of love or any conditional act with a reservation, like I will love you if you love me. He observes that even the inkling on my part of something like this going on by another completely destroys this kind of demand for a response in loving. This is because the compelling quality for the response of love, in quotes, lies in the very meaning of loving as loving and not in my subjective intentions or desires. The creative, improvisational, personal nature of loving already precludes any putative response or reply by rote. In both regards, loving and hating are not parallel or coeval acts. Rather, hating is founded in loving such that hating takes place on the ground of loving, which is already taking place. When we examine hating, we're getting at the problem of original and uncaused emergence of hating. In the more traditional ontological and sometimes theological terms, we're getting at the problem of evil. While there's nothing absolutely compelling to hate, while there's no absolute ought to hate, the hated does appear in its own modality. And in this modality, I would call it here, just to be brief, the modality of the negatable, the refutable, the deniable, contravenable, refusable, or excludable. Now, I just want to make a little bit more precise that relation of founding. Do I have enough? Or just let me know if that's a little bit more? Okay. So we can ask, in what way is hating founded in loving? And the difficulty in asking that question is because we're, I think, not very clear about what we mean by founding. We use founding, grounding, and everything all the time. So I don't want to say that hating's grounded in loving. So I'm going to make a distinction that I think is kind of there in the literature, but in a very implicit way. Literature, in other words, when people who were reading from Mary Daly to Heidegger use ground, it tends to be in an ontological sense. That is to say, being as grounded in another being, or being is a ground or not a ground, or it's co-grounding, or a life world ontology is grounded in a life world ontology. Those are so ontological terms. Founding and founding relations were concerned with certain relations of we could say constitution. So acts in relation to acts, and so on. That in many ways are unproblematic. Merleau-Ponty speaks about in Husserl aesthetic as foundational for a logic or perception founds truth. Okay, in some way these are really unproblematic. There are many other examples. I won't go through them. We can, now there's two quick relations of founding here I just want to mention. A positive relation of founding and being founded. So, for example, the relationship between objectivating and non-objectivating acts. Acts have a positive relation, or again, the relationship between locutionary, illocutionary, perlocutionary acts. Those would have a positive relation of founding. But then there's another kind of founding that's a negative one, and there are, I think, two kinds. One is a contrary relation of founding, and another is an antithetical relation of founding. So the determination of hating as founded in loving is dependent upon clarifying it then as a kind of dependent movement that moves on relation of loving contrary to loving. And then the antithetical we would can think of here as something like the slovenliness of spirit, or or complacency or apathy that isn't contrary to loving or hating, but is antithetical to loving and to hating. Okay, well that's the main term. Those are the main things I wanted to mention. So let me just go to my conclusion, just wrap it up in this conclusion. Hating is a contrary movement because it's oriented toward the negation of the very basis that provides what is to be negated in the diminishing of the hated. At its core, it hates the beloved as bearer of value that emerges on the basis of primordial loving. But even this contrary movement to loving reveals the deep loving of primordial loving, because I can enact myself in my freedom to restrict that loving. In that loving, the emphasis is positive and is oriented toward who or what others are to be, or who or what they can become. This entails the freedom to negate. Because hating as moving within this updraft of loving bears on all levels of reality, hating on one dimension is implicitly the negating on all levels of reality, at least implicitly. So, and just as a summary, I just remind everyone, we're looking at the ways in which feeling and feeling states can be distinguished, and in relationship to that, hating and hatred as feeling on the one hand and hatred on the other, and the relation of hating to loving, not as a parallel movement or a coeval or even dialectical movement, but as a hating standing in a particular, or I should say moving in a particular relation to loving, and I understand it as a contrary movement. Okay. Thank you.